This is Mike Koenigs. I'm here today with Tim Ferriss. He's New York Times #1 best-selling author, two times, unbelievable, both with the 4-Hour Workweek and with the 4-Hour Body. And this is Success Leaves Clues. It's an interview with him talking really about the philosophy, some of the things that have driven him, what's made him strong, how he's dealt with his success, what's brought him to this place, a little bit about his family, what his mom did for him, about his upbringing. And I think you're really going to enjoy it, and you're going to enjoy this bonus that we're giving to you for actually taking action and getting his book. So let's get rolling, shall we?
Let's do it.
First question then is, what are the biggest principles that have taken you from where you were to where you are today?
The principles are reflected also in the answer that I give if somebody asks me, what is your goal in life? Which I think is a very overly broad question to ask. But the answer is, as cliched as it sounds, to love, be loved, and never stop learning. And the learning has been with me for the longest. So that started very, very early, and we can talk about that. Just the love of learning. And I think that there is a way that was instilled in me very purposefully. Then the be loved. Of course, everybody wants to be loved, but I found that can backfire really easily if that's your focus. Whereas if you focus on loving other people, part of which is sharing the hard lessons that you've learned or teaching, I just encapsulate it in that trinity, which is very easy for me to remember. And if anything's going wrong, or if I perceive that something is on the downslide, professionally, personally, or otherwise, it's usually because I'm neglecting one of those three in that order. So love, be loved, never stop learning. But the learning piece, we want to talk about the very early days. My parents we didn't have much money. My parents never made more than about $50K a year combined, which doesn't put us in the poorhouse, but it's not a lot with 2 kids. And they never wanted me to count to French and to 10 or to play the piano in front of dinner guests or anything like that. What my mom did to get us to learn and to do things was to expose us to a lot of environments, my brother and I. So she would just take us to the aquarium, take us to the beach, take us to these various environments, take us to different plays that were inexpensive, show us different books, and eventually something would click, and then she would help channel our interest into those areas. So for me, it was marine biology first. I wanted to be a marine biologist for many, many years. Then it was illustration. I wanted to be a professional illustrator. I was actually, that's how I paid part of my way at Princeton for 2 years, so as a professional illustrator. And then for a pretty long period of time, felt convinced that I would be a teacher of some type at this critical inflectionary point for most people, somewhere in high school or early college. Felt like that's where I could have the greatest impact. And it just so happened that the book came along very accidentally, and then I realized that the greatest leverage was from using the book and the blog.
Very good. So how about inspiration? Now, you talk about your mom and exposure, and and she was smart enough to cultivate stuff that clicked. But do you remember a moment where you had something, an object, a movie, a scene, a toy, or something where it was sort of like you had this aha, and if you look backwards in time, and you could just be like, oh man, there's a straight line from where I am today to what that thing was?
My life's a collection of, there's not much straight, but there is one moment that comes to mind. I was given a clipped out newspaper article, local newspaper. This is on Long Island.
How old were you?
I was 12, probably 12. And my mom had found this clipping about a kung fu teacher nearby in a place called Sag Harbor out on Long Island. And she gave it to me. I was like, oh, this is amazing. I want to meet this guy. I want to study. I want to learn kung fu. Oh my God. Got all excited. And I'd done some wrestling up to that point. My mom had very wisely learned from the other tribe of mothers that you could really tire out hyperactive kids by throwing them into wrestling practice for a few hours. And she took me to this school, which was just a class in the guy's basement. And a bunch of big dudes, construction workers, the whole 9 yards, and no kids. And I just walked in, and my mom was a little nervous. She's like, okay. And we're talking to the teacher, saying, oh, Tim would really like to learn this, that, and the other thing. It's like, okay, listened very politely and explained what the school's about, showed a few moves, showed this, that, and the other thing. And then he said, I'll show you one of the techniques that you would learn here. And he's like, hold this. And so I held this little sandbag, it was like that thick, against my chest. And he just pounded me in the chest and sent me flying back like 12 feet onto my ass. And my mom was just, couldn't even respond. And I got up and then I was like, okay, how did you do it? And that was like after I gained my composure. And it was just his test. He wanted to see if I was going to be a waste of time and come down and expect special treatment as a kid and so forth and so on. And I went up to the bathroom and my mom was like, well, okay, if that's what he wants, then this is what he wants. And he said, I don't think he belongs here. Like, I don't think that this is going to be the right place for him. My mom was like, no, he'll train really hard. Trust me. Like, he'll train as hard as any of these other guys here. And that conveyed to me the importance of enduring pain and inoculating yourself against fear of failure, which there's a lot of talk about fear and failure, and there are a lot of very memorable one-liners, but the one that sticks with me, because failure sucks, it hurts. There's no two ways about it. You can paint it any way you want, but it hurts. And what I ended up learning was to view failure as feedback. Failure is feedback. That's it. And the best way to condition yourself in that way, I think, is through some type of competitive athletics. It doesn't need to be at a high level. It could be a club sport soccer. But to continually be failing, even in the most perfect of games, you will make mistakes. And just to constantly face that and realize that it's feedback. It's feedback. And you change your approach until you win, until you get what you want. Or until you're the best version of yourself that you can be in that context. And that's been very valuable for me. So whenever I'm interviewed and some people ask me, what's your biggest failure? And I'm like, I can't. It's not because I don't have them. I've just brainwashed myself so effectively, I just don't see them that way. I don't categorize them somewhere in my brain where I even can recall them easily because I'm so accustomed to it through sports. So,
which of your attributes do you believe has most contributed to your success and your ability to succeed?
Vocal curiosity. So my mom helped a lot with the curiosity piece, and I learned to ask why a lot, even when confronted with experts who don't particularly like being asked why. Teachers, wasn't always the most popular student for that reason. And it shows you how little justification many people have for most of their opinions or beliefs. And Ricardo Semler, who I don't think he founded it, but he runs a company, or did run a company called Semco in Brazil. It's a huge company. It's like the Virgin of Brazil. Mm-hmm. And he said, ask why 3 times. Because the first 2 won't get to the root of the answer, and the last will get to the root of the answer. And I think that that's very instructive. So learning to question assumptions has been certainly the basis for these 2 books, but a lot that came before that as well.
So let's talk about the biggest adversities, the biggest trials that have either prevented you from achieving your goal, basically writing 2 books. Mm-hmm. You didn't set out for them to be bestsellers, obviously. Mm-hmm. But you've obviously had other things that you've accomplished. Mm-hmm. And the books have also been a vehicle to get you there.
Right.
So let's talk about, a specific goal and some of the things that have blocked you that you've overcome very, very consciously.
Well, 4-Hour Workweek was catalyzed initially by a huge personal failure, I would say. And that was, I had a long-term girlfriend mid-2004, been dating for about 2 years. Closest I've come to thinking I would get engaged to someone, and just called it off. I'm done. And it was over one day because of my work schedule. From 7 a.m. to 9 p.m., chasing the time zones. I had distributors in something like 15 countries for the sports nutrition company. And she gave me a plaque. It wasn't really a plaque. It was one of those folding photo holders, like the wire brushed, like Target photo holders. And it had a collage on one side, which she put a lot of work into this. I was pretty impressed in a depressing way. It had a photograph of my head, like in profile, me in a business suit running with a briefcase with papers flying out. And then in the middle it said, business hours end at 5 p.m. She's like, you should keep this on your desk, just for your own personal health. I was like, wow, you really thought this through. Okay. And it underscored the reality that income has no value without time. 0, none. there is some abstract exceptions to that, but for the most part, from a lifestyle standpoint, zero. And that led to reorganizing my whole company, traveling for 4 weeks to do that in London, then extending that to 18 months of travel, which just randomly led me all over the place to Argentina, teaching a class, teaching or giving a Princeton lecture via phone from Argentina, and using this term lifestyle design because I couldn't find another replacement for it. And that led to a student saying, ha ha ha, you should just write a book and be done with it. I don't understand why you're talking to 50 students. Just this like offhand joke. And that led to the book. But the book was not smooth sailing from the outset. I was turned down by 3 out of 4 agents. Once I decided I wanted to give it a shot, I was turned down and I was introduced to these agents by Jack Canfield, keep in mind. And I was still turned down. And that was with Jack's help. So they probably wouldn't have ever even returned my phone call or email in the first place. Turned down by 3, and they're good agents. Like, they just had a different set of rules, and I fell outside the rules. That's fine. Good investors do the same thing. And then the last, Steve Hanselman signed me on. And then we were proceeded to be turned down by 26 out of 27 publishers. And then Crown finally said yes, and that's when the real work started. So the real battle is not in selling the book, though. That's, I think, a critical mistake. The battle is getting through the entire publishing process with a book that you're extremely proud of, because you will have to fight tooth and nail to obstruct and block and defeat committee think at every step of the way. And that was hugely, hugely tough for me. I lose my patience really quickly with bureaucracy and committees, and it's not always a good thing. So that was very, very challenging for me.
But really, what is it that kept you going? So if we continue with the book, obviously the real work started. You had to basically come up with a format and a structure. You clearly have modeled people. You educated and self-educated. Fear of failure isn't necessarily one of your attributes, but it's probably fear of not being excellent. Certainly is. You are a perfectionist.
Yeah, I can tell you why. It's partially with training. So I've also spent a lot of time reading Stoic philosophy, specifically Seneca and Letters from a Stoic, among others, and really trying at all times to set the conditions for success, to set the conditions for the ideal outcome, but to have very low expectations simultaneously. And it takes conditioning to do that, to effectively say, what is the worst case scenario? So I write this book, it gets published, it sells 5 copies. Okay, can I live with that outcome? Yes. All right. Well, now what if I sell 5 copies and it changes 3 of those people's lives? Will it be worth having spent a year of my life to write this book? Yeah, I think so. So once I am comfortable with the worst case scenario, it gives me much greater confidence to fight for what I want, what I believe will change the world in the most dramatic fashion possible, because it's not based from a position of fear. Like, if there's nothing, in other words, when I feel there's nothing they could take away from me that would hurt more than having a mediocre outcome, okay, I'm unbeatable in that circumstance. Like, he who cares less wins. I think in every negotiation is true. And when you read Stoic philosophy, especially Seneca, because he wrote in Latin more than Greek, and it translates to English more effectively, among other things, you can really call the shots. It's amazing, but it's just this flip of perspective. It's like flipping a switch in your head. So I think that's part of the reason that I don't have as much of a fear of failure, because I define failure very, very clearly, and I come to terms with it first. But in terms of excellence, I really recognize there are many factors outside of my control. What is it? The Lord's Prayer, is it? Grant me the wisdom to separate the things that I can change versus those I can't. I'm paraphrasing very roughly.
Not the Lord's Prayer.
It's not the Lord's Prayer. It's not the one whatever that one is. You can see I'm a biblical scholar showing off my knowledge. But that is very important. And I've come to realize how many variables are outside of our control. For example, 4-Hour Body, I'm selling the 4-Hour Body. I expected that my publisher would make a fairly lackluster offer and that we would get through the right of first refusal period, then I'd take it out to auction. That was my expectation. Instead, they came back with a pretty strong offer. It's like, ooh, okay, bird in the hand, 2 in the bush, what are we going to do? And then this was September 2008, and then the entire market just collapsed. And suddenly everyone's getting fired. Heads of publishing houses are getting fired, completely restructuring. And I took the deal for a lot of reasons. But could I have predicted that? How would things have turned out if I'd gone to a different publisher? Who knows? But I had no control over that. And there are a lot of factors outside my control. So I try to set the conditions within my power for success. And to say I'm unattached to an outcome is ridiculous. Of course I'm attached to an outcome. I would rather be number 5 than number 2. It's just my personality. Because number 2 is like, you tried really hard, but you didn't try. Didn't try enough. You had that much left and you quit. Loser. Number 5 is like, I didn't even really put in the effort to be in the top 3. So I'm very attached to an outcome, but I know that I can live with a failure before I even get into it.
So you succeed. And this basically means we've got to define success to Tim Ferriss. What is success? And I'm going to say, what was it when you hit your first big, massive, and then what is it now?
So I think there's short-term and then there's long-term success in different contexts. For me, as long as coming back to the failure is feedback, as long as I am learning, if I'm making more money than ever, but my learning curve goes from this to this, that's failure for me. So the speed and diversity of my learning is really how I calibrate my success or failure for most things. But let's take the New York Times as an example. So New York Times bestseller. I remember I just finished a radio satellite tour, which is one of the most exhausting experiences you can ever have. You wake up at 5 a.m. and you do 10 to 30 minute radio shows back to back to back until 5 p.m. It's just, it destroys you. And I did this. This was on a Wednesday. And so about 5:15 Eastern Standard, I'm sitting down at this table, passed out, trying to finish off my lukewarm coffee to keep me alive. And I get a call from my editor, Heather. And she goes, "Hey, Tim, you hit the list." And I remember saying, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to curse or not, but I was like, "Heather, don't fuck with me." Not right now. Not today. I'm too tired. I can't do it. She goes, "No, you hit the New York Times list, Mr. New York Times bestselling author." And I remember just being in this surreal, dazed state and like leaning against the wall and sliding down and just kind of like holding my head and putting my head on my knees and being at a lack of word, lack of thoughts. And then I would get up and I'd be like, okay. And I'd walk like 30 feet down the hallway and then just like lean against the wall and slide down again. Just be like, okay, things are going to change. Things are going to change a bit. And they did. Changed a lot. Everything changed, just about everything. So I would say that it was extremely gratifying, but I'm exceptionally competitive, and I did appreciate it. I took time to enjoy it. But 72 hours later, it's like, all right, now what? That was a fun sugar high, but from an existential standpoint, there's more to be done. How do I actually make this a movement, not just a one-week bestseller?
So let's go to, so that was then. This is now. And, we were just talking a little bit about evolution, how you've evolved, where you've evolved. And so you did it again. So now you can do it again. And you've used practically the same formula, which it basically comes down to substantive relationships, not selling out, creating a great product that's timeless and evergreen. You've mentioned that. Supporting your community and being able to deliver truth and transparency. Okay, so all those things matter. And in your new book, you're talking about family. So there's clearly an evolution of Tim occurring. What's success now?
I'd say in the broadest sense, not looking internally, but holistically as best I can. I'd say it's doing the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people before I'm erased from the planet, however that happens. That's it. And it sounds very grandiose, but I've had 4 or 5 friends diagnosed with cancer this year. I've had a number of friends die. I've had one daughter of a friend of mine, 12 years old, just a few days ago, before New Year's, dead, cancer. And people, I think, very dangerously make long-term plans based on postponing what they actually want to do or the relationships they want to have based on the assumption that they're going to live for another 10, 20, 30 years. I think that's very, very dangerous. And so I'm trying to get as much done before that happens. That's it. I don't expect to die around the corner, but it could happen. So every time I take off in a plane or land in a plane, just before touchdown or just before takeoff, I ask myself, if I died right now, would I be happy with how I've been spending my time for the last few weeks? Or would I be satisfied with what I've done? And it's a good question. And I didn't realize this, but I had been doing that for a number of months, and then I heard that Steve Jobs does the same thing, but he does it every morning in the mirror. And if you haven't, for those of you watching, if you haven't listened to Steve Jobs' commencement speech at Stanford, listen to that. It'll put a lot in perspective. But I think sounds morbid, but becoming familiar and comfortable with death and the fact that it's unpredictable allows you to really make much better decisions. And it allows you to filter the signal from the noise much more effectively.
You've got leverage. You've got visibility. In some ways you don't have peace anymore, and you have the unenviable position of not knowing who actually cares about Tim the person versus Tim the character. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you have to sift and sort between who's real and what they want all the time. And that also means you've got more opportunities than you can possibly. You have to practice saying no like crazy. So how do you make a decision? How do you sift, sort, and decide?
Well, I take an extremely honest inventory of a few things. The first is the 20% of activities that consume 80+% of my time. And if there's anything I don't like on that list or prefer to spend less time on, which is usually everything on that list, then making a policy of elimination. So my policy is progressive elimination. That perfection is the elimination of the unnecessary rather than the addition of something missing. I feel like I have all of the core ingredients I need for a very enjoyable and productive life. I have fantastic friendships. I have wonderful family. I have health. I also have not, and this comes back to reading Stoic philosophy and Seneca in particular, I've taken a very methodical approach to limiting the number of unnecessary necessities that I have in my life. So if someone offers me a really big carrot, I'll give you $1 million to do this, and I just don't trust them. I get a gut instinct. I'm like, no thanks. Like, how could you turn it down? It's $1 million for this much time. I'm like, doesn't add anything to my life that I need. Sorry. And practicing saying no is important. It's important to practice saying no when it doesn't matter so that you can say no when it does matter. So I practice saying no to little things constantly so that when I have a judgment call that will affect me long term, I'm just conditioned to feel comfortable with saying no. Other policies, this is more tactical perhaps, but for periods of time, weeks or months, I'll just say, hey, I'm not calendaring anything. They'll be like, hey, let's jump on the phone next week. Let's meet up next week. I'm not calendaring anything, but I might be free around Tuesday to Thursday. Just try to call me. If you catch me, we'll talk. If not, just hit or miss. Sorry. That really eliminates a lot of stress. The other thing I'll do is if somebody sends me a pitch of some type, almost inevitably say, can't do anything now. If this is still relevant in 8 weeks, like email me in 8 weeks. If it's something I'll absolutely not do, then I'll just say, man, I'm not interested. Or I'll have my assistant turn it down, which is always easier. But if it's something I might be interested in, I'll say, contact me in 8 weeks if you're still interested. 99% will never follow up. And the people who do, I'm like, okay, you just passed character test number 1. Now we'll look at your stuff. And also realizing that you can buy anything but time. You can buy anything but time. And if you have those 1,000 true fans, you don't even need to buy it. You can ask for almost anything and receive almost anything except for time. And so you should be very, very, very selfish with your time. when it comes to people who want something from you in a materialistic way. I also think that one of the best ways to put things in perspective is to spend time with those less fortunate than yourself. So, all right, you think you're poor because you live in, I have no idea. Let's just say Brooklyn, and you're making a measly $120,000 a year, whatever. It's like, okay, go work in a soup kitchen in Harlem for a weekend. Then let's talk. All of a sudden, all those fake needs just go away for many people. So I think that's also a good practice. So to really beat a dead horse with this whole Seneca shtick that I'm on, Seneca would say, occasionally, let's say once a month, wear the scantest of fare, meaning just cheap clothing, and eat the measliest of food, and ask yourself all the while, is this the condition I so feared? So practice your worst case scenario. If I made half as much income, if I didn't get that big deal, is this the condition I feared? And you realize it's just not that bad. And then you're in a position of strength to say no to the things that matter very, very little, which is the majority.